Hello there, and welcome to Wind Down History. I'm glad you found your way here, because tonight we'll be drifting through the life of Charlemagne. Wherever you are, let this be your moment to slow down. Let the day soften, the edges blur, and your thoughts settle. He was the father of Europe, a titan who forged an empire from the ruins of the old world. But while many stories focus heavily on the battles, the swords, and the dates on a map, tonight we will simply follow the path of his life, the details, the decisions, and the world as he saw it. Before we settle in, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight and what time it is there. Please let me know in the comments below. It is always fascinating to see how far these quiet stories reach. Tonight's story begins in the autumn of 768, in the quiet sanctuary of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris. Here, the king of the Franks, Pepin the Short, breathed his last. For the kingdom, this was a moment of profound instability. In the modern world, we are accustomed to the idea of a single heir, the eldest child taking the throne to ensure continuity. But the Franks followed an older, more volatile tradition. They viewed a kingdom not as a political office, but as personal property, something to be divided among sons like furniture or silver. And so, the vast Frankish realm was sliced in two. Two young men stood over their father's grave. The elder was Charles, a man of 26, already tall, vigorous, and brimming with a restless energy that would one day earn him the name Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne. Beside him stood his younger brother, Charlemagne. He was barely 17, a young man navigating the difficult transition from adolescence to authority. History often paints Charlemagne as the inevitable hero, casting a shadow so large it eclipses everyone around him. But in 768, that shadow fell most heavily on his brother. From the very moment the crown was placed on their heads, on the very same day in two separate cities, a cold tension settled over the royal house. The partition of the land seemed almost designed to provoke conflict. Charlemagne received a vast crescent of territory that hugged the Atlantic coast and the northern plains, wrapping around his brother's lands like a pair of arms. Charlemagne held the centre, a compact and wealthy inner kingdom that included Burgundy and Provence. On a map, it looked as though the older brother was encircling the younger. To Charlemagne, it must have felt like a siege before the first arrow was even fired. The relationship between the brothers had never been warm, but the weight of the crown turned distance into hostility. We do not have the transcripts of their arguments, but the actions of the court spoke volumes. The nobles sensed the rift immediately. In the great halls and draughty corridors of the Frankish palaces, courtiers began to choose sides, whispering allegiances in quiet corners. A kingdom divided is a kingdom vulnerable, and the wolves were already circling the borders. The first test of this fragile dual monarchy arrived quickly, rising from the restless region of Aquitaine. The people there, fiercely independent and culturally distinct, saw the death of the old king as an opportunity to break free. They rose in rebellion, challenging the authority of the new Frankish masters. Charlemagne, true to his nature, decided to act immediately. He gathered his forces and prepared to march south to restore order. He called upon Charlemagne to join him. It was a standard request. Brothers and co-kings were expected to fight as one to defend their father's legacy. They met at a place called Montcontour to discuss the campaign. The meeting was a disaster. Details of the encounter are scarce, preserved only in brief, guarded lines in the royal annals. But the outcome was clear. There was a sharp disagreement, a clash of wills that ended with Charlemagne turning his back on the war. He withdrew his support and marched his army home, leaving Charlemagne to face the rebellion alone. It was a public humiliation. For a medieval king, authority was everything. To be abandoned on the field by one's own brother was a signal of weakness that could shatter a reign before it truly began. Charlemagne stood at a precipice. If he failed in Aquitaine, his enemies would multiply, and his brother's calculated neutrality would look like wisdom. But Charlemagne did not fail. He marched into Aquitaine with a fury and efficiency that would become his trademark. He dismantled the rebellion systematically, chasing the rebel leader Hunald until there was nowhere left to run. He returned to the north not as a weakened half-king, but as a victor who had succeeded despite his brother's betrayal. The victory in Aquitaine settled the borders, but it poisoned the bloodline. The trust between the brothers was shattered beyond repair. The Frankish court lived in a state of suspended breath, waiting for the inevitable civil war. It was no longer a question of if the brothers would fight, but when. However, there was one person who refused to let the family destroy itself. She was a woman of formidable will and political intellect who watched the rising tides of hatred with a mother's anxious eye. Her name was Bertrada, the widow of Pepin, and she was about to step onto the board to play a very dangerous game of chess. In the courts of the 8th century, power was often assumed to be the sole province of men holding swords. But in the Frankish kingdom, one of the most potent forces was a woman holding nothing but her own counsel. Queen Bertrada, the mother of Charlemagne and Carloman, was not content to sit in a convent and pray for peace. She was a woman of immense political acumen, determined to weave the frayed edges of her family back together before they tore the kingdom apart. While her sons glared at one another across a fortified border, Bertrada launched a diplomatic offensive. In 770, she embarked on a grand tour, travelling first to the court of her younger son, Charlemagne, and then crossing the Alps into Bavaria and Italy. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a family visit. In reality, it was a high-stakes negotiation designed to encircle the Frankish realm with allies and force her sons into a truce. Her most audacious move involved the kingdom of the Lombards in northern Italy. The Lombards were the traditional enemies of the Franks and the sworn adversaries of the Pope in Rome. Yet Bertrada saw an opportunity. She negotiated a double marriage alliance. She proposed that Charlemagne should marry the daughter of the Lombard king, Desiderius. It was a masterstroke of pragmatism, but it sent shockwaves through the political landscape. The reaction from Rome was immediate and vitriolic. Pope Stephen III was horrified. He viewed the Lombards not just as political rivals, but as a spiritual contagion. When news of the engagement reached the Lateran Palace, the Pope penned a furious letter to Charlemagne. He described the proposed union as diabolical, urging the young king to reject the stench of the Lombard bloodline. It was rare for a pope to speak with such visceral disgust, a testament to how deeply Bertrada's diplomacy had unsettled the established order. Despite the clerical fury, Charlemagne listened to his mother. He set aside his first wife, or perhaps she was a concubine, of the records are deliberately vague, a woman named Himiltrude, who had already borne him a son. In a move that displayed the cold clarity of his ambition, he welcomed the Lombard princess, known to history as Desiderata, into his court. For a brief moment, Bertrada's web held firm. There was peace. The marriage connected the Franks to the Lombards, isolating Charlemagne and forcing him to remain quiet. It seemed that the mother had saved her sons from themselves. But the peace was an illusion, built on a marriage that Charlemagne found increasingly intolerable. We do not know the private details of the relationship between Charlemagne and Desiderata. Some chroniclers suggest she was sickly. Others imply a simple lack of chemistry. But the most likely explanation is political. Charlemagne was a man who preferred to dictate terms, not inherit them. The marriage bound him to the Lombard king, restricting his ability to expand south. He was a predator, being asked to live peacefully with his prey. After only 1 year, the web snapped. In 771, Charlemagne made a decision that shocked the courts of Europe. He repudiated Desiderata. He did not simply separate from her, he sent her back to her father in Italy, like a piece of defective merchandise. It was a calculated public insult, a slap in the face to King Desiderius that no monarch could ignore. The humiliation of Desiderata is one of those quiet tragedies, often buried under the weight of great events. We can only imagine the journey back across the Alps, the shame of the returned bride, and the fury of her father as he welcomed her home. Charlemagne had not just ended a marriage, he had declared a diplomatic war. To make matters worse for the Lombard alliance, Charlemagne immediately remarried. His new choice was a Swabian noblewoman named Hildegard. She was young, barely 13 at the time, but she would become the great love of his life. Unlike the political arrangement with Desiderata, this union was fertile and enduring. Hildegard would bear him 9 children and follow him on his endless campaigns, a constant presence in the mobile city of the Frankish court. Bertrada's grand plan lay in ruins. She had strived for unity, but her son's actions had accelerated the path to conflict. The alliance with the Lombards was shattered. The Pope was wary, and Charlemagne was watching from the sidelines, likely relieved that his brother had made so many enemies so quickly. The stage was set for a total collapse. But history has a way of intervening when the tension is at its highest. Just as the drums of civil war began to beat in earnest, a sudden silence fell over the house of Charlemagne. The winter of 771 descended on the Frankish kingdom with its usual biting cold, but the chill felt particularly sharp in the villa of Samoussy, where Charlemagne held his court. Since the humiliation of the Aquitaine campaign, the younger brother had been consolidating his power, likely preparing for the open conflict that everyone knew was coming. But on December 4th, the preparations stopped forever. Charlemagne died. He was only 20 years old. The suddenness of his death, coming so conveniently for his rival brother, inevitably sparked whispers in the darker corners of the court. Was it a fever? A sudden nosebleed, as some chroniclers claimed? Or was it something more sinister? A cup of wine laced with wolfsbane or hemlock? History does not record exactly what happened, though the timing was suspicious enough to leave a permanent stain of doubt on the narrative. However, in the game of kings, grief is a luxury that ambition cannot afford. Charlemagne did not hesitate. He did not wait for the mourning period to end, nor did he wait for the traditional assembly of nobles to debate the succession. He moved with breathtaking speed. The moment the news reached him, he rode straight to Corbeny, a royal villa deep within his brother's territory. This was a moment of supreme political theatre. Charlemagne had left behind 2 young sons, infants who were technically the rightful heirs to their father's share of the kingdom. By law and custom, the land should have passed to them, perhaps under a regency. But Charlemagne arrived not as an uncle to protect his nephews, but as a monarch demanding total submission. The nobles of Charlemagne's court faced a stark choice. They could support a toddler king and face the wrath of Charlemagne's battle-hardened army, or they could bend the knee to the strongest man in Europe. The choice was made quickly. One by one, the great counts and bishops of the southern kingdom, including Wilchar, the Archbishop of Sens, and Warin, a powerful count, rode to Corbeny and pledged their loyalty to Charlemagne. In a single stroke, without drawing a sword, Charlemagne had reunited the Frankish realm. The division of 768 was erased. He was now the sole king of the Franks. But amidst the coronation feasts and the swearing of oaths, a small desperate drama was unfolding in the shadows. Gerberga, the widow of Charlemagne, watched the rapid defection of her husband's loyalists with growing terror. She realized that for Charlemagne to be truly secure, her sons, his nephews, represented a loose end. In the brutal mathematics of dynastic succession, potential heirs were often liabilities to be removed. Driven by a mother's primal instinct for survival, Gerberga made a decision that would ignite a war. She did not submit. Instead, she took her children, a handful of loyal advisors, and fled into the night. It was a perilous journey. She could not hide in Francia, for Charlemagne's reach was now total. She had to cross the frontier. In a twist of supreme irony, she sought refuge with the very man Charlemagne had just insulted, King Desiderius of the Lombards. Imagine the scene at the Lombard court in Pavia. Only months earlier, Desiderius had been seething with rage over the return of his rejected daughter, Desiderata. Now, the widow of Charlemagne's brother arrived at his gates, clutching the true heirs to half the Frankish kingdom. For Desiderius, this was a gift from the heavens. He now held the ultimate political weapon. 2 boys with a legitimate claim to Charlemagne's throne. If he could convince the Pope to anoint them as kings, he could split the Frankish realm apart once again. Charlemagne, sitting securely in his palace at Aachen, surely understood the gravity of the situation. He had the crown, and he had the land. But across the icy peaks of the Alps, his enemies were gathering in a single room. The rejected father-in-law, the fleeing sister-in-law, and the dispossessed nephews were now united by a common grievance. The storm had not passed. It had merely moved south. And this time, it would not be settled by weddings or whispers, but by the total destruction of a kingdom. In the spring of 773, the inevitable collision finally occurred. King Desiderius, emboldened by the presence of Charlemagne's fugitive nephews, marched his troops south towards Rome. His demand was simple but explosive. He wanted the Pope to anoint the boys as the true kings of the Franks. It was a direct challenge to Charlemagne's legitimacy, wrapped in the guise of religious ceremony. Pope Adrian I, a man of stiff spine and shrewd politics, refused. He barricaded the gates of Rome and sent a desperate plea north to Charlemagne. The message was clear. The protector of the church was required. Charlemagne did not rush blindly into war. In a move that displayed his growing maturity as a statesman, he first offered a massive sum of gold to Desiderius in exchange for peace and the return of papal lands. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Desiderius, mistaking caution for weakness, refused. He believed the Alps were an impenetrable wall that no large army could cross without disaster. He was wrong. Charlemagne split his forces into two vast columns and threaded them through the mountain passes of Mont Cenis and the Great Saint Bernard. It was a logistical masterpiece. By the time the Lombard scouts realized what was happening, the Franks were already pouring onto the plains of Italy like a sudden flood. Desiderius, outmaneuvered and panicked, retreated behind the massive walls of his capital, Pavia. The loud part of this war, the skirmishes and the shouting, was over quickly. What followed was a long, silent strangulation. The siege of Pavia lasted for nearly 10 months, from the autumn of 773 through the summer of 774. While his army encircled the city, Charlemagne did not merely sit in a tent. He spent the winter in a villa nearby, having his wife Hildegard and his children brought down from the north. It was a display of supreme confidence. While the Lombards inside the walls were starving, eating leather and boiled grass to survive, Charlemagne was holding court and celebrating Easter a few miles away. It was a psychological weapon more potent than any catapult. Inside Pavia, the will of King Desiderius slowly crumbled. The Iron King watched his city wither. But the darkest mystery of the siege concerns the fate of Gerberga and her sons, Charlemagne's nephews. They had taken shelter in Verona, but as the Frankish net tightened, they were captured and brought to Charlemagne. After that moment, they simply vanish from the pages of history. There is no record of their execution, no account of their imprisonment, and no mention of their exile. They are simply erased. Did Charlemagne order the death of his own nephews to secure his throne? Or were they shorn of their hair and hidden away in a monastery, living out their days in anonymous silence? The silence of the chroniclers is perhaps the most chilling answer we could receive. By June of 774, Pavia could hold out no longer. The gates opened and Desiderius surrendered. Charlemagne's justice was swift but distinctively bloodless. He did not execute the Lombard king. Instead, he sentenced Desiderius and his wife to a monastery and a convent. The warrior king was forced to trade his sword for a prayer book, living out the rest of his life as a monk in Corby. It was a humiliation effectively designed to strip him of power without creating a martyr. Then Charlemagne did something unprecedented. Upon entering the city, he took the Iron Crown of the Lombards, a circlet of gold and jewels said to contain a nail from the true cross, and placed it on his own head. He did not annex the land into Francia. He absorbed the title. He called himself Rex Francorum et Langobardorum, King of the Franks and the Lombards. It was a clear signal to the world. Charlemagne was not just a tribal chieftain expanding his borders. He was an emperor in the making, a man capable of holding multiple crowns and multiple peoples in the palm of a single hand. As he rode back north, leaving a conquered Italy behind him, Charlemagne might have felt that his greatest challenges were over. But in the dense, dark forests of the north, a different kind of fire was beginning to burn, one that would consume the next 30 years of his life. While Charlemagne was securing crowns of gold in the warm, civilized south, a very different kind of threat was festering on his northern border. If Italy was a land of marble cities, written laws, and ancient memories, Saxony was a realm of mud, mist, and impenetrable forests. The Saxons were the last great pagan holdout of the region. They were a fierce, fragmented people who worshipped the old gods: Woden, Thuna and Saxnot. Unlike the Franks or the Lombards, they had no single king to defeat, no capital city to capture, and no central army to crush. They were a hydra of loose tribes and warrior bands, bound together only by their language and their fierce refusal to bow to the Christian God or the Frankish king. For decades, the border between the Franks and the Saxons had been an open wound. It was a place of constant raids, burning villages, and broken treaties. But in 772, Charlemagne decided that the time for border skirmishes was over. He resolved to solve the Saxon problem once and for all. He did not launch a raid, he launched a crusade. The target of his first great campaign was not a fortress or a city, but a symbol. Deep in the heart of the Saxon forests, near the modern town of Paderborn, stood the Irminsul. The Irminsul was more than just a shrine. It was the spiritual anchor of the Saxon people. It was a massive ancient tree trunk, or perhaps a wooden pillar erected towards the heavens, that they believed held up the sky. It was the Universalis Columna, the pillar of the universe. To the Saxons, this wood connected the earth to the divine. As long as the Irminsul stood, their world was safe. Charlemagne understood the power of symbols. He knew that to conquer the Saxons, he had to do more than defeat their warriors. He had to break their spirit. He marched his army deep into the Teutoburg forest, cutting a path through the dense, dark woods that had terrified Roman legions centuries before. When he reached the sanctuary of the Irminsul, he did not hesitate. In a calculated act of spiritual warfare, he ordered the destruction of the site. The Franks smashed the shrine. They hacked down the great pillar that held up the sky. They looted the gold and silver treasures that had been offered to the gods over generations. It was a brutal, decisive desecration. Chronicles from the time tell us that during this campaign the Frankish army was nearly undone by thirst. The summer heat was oppressive, and the rivers ran dry. Just as panic began to set in, a sudden spring of water reportedly burst from a dry riverbed at the foot of a mountain. To Charlemagne and his men, this was not a geological coincidence. It was a divine verdict. It was proof that the Christian God was with them, and the Saxon gods were powerless to protect their own sanctuary. Charlemagne left the forest laden with gold and convinced of his victory. He believed he had proved the superiority of his faith and his sword. He took hostages, secured promises of peace, and marched home, thinking the war was effectively won. But he had misunderstood his enemy. By destroying the Irminsul, Charlemagne had not broken the Saxons, he had radicalized them. He had turned a political conflict into a blood feud. The Saxons looked at the shattered remains of their holy site and saw proof that the Frankish king was an existential threat to their way of existence. They realized they could not negotiate with a man who wanted to erase their soul. The destruction of the Irminsul was meant to be the end. Instead, it was merely the opening move of a savage, grinding war that would last for 33 years. A war that would stain Charlemagne's legacy and push his moral endurance to its absolute limit. And rising from the ashes of that destroyed shrine was a leader who would become Charlemagne's dark mirror, a man who would haunt his dreams for decades. Every great conqueror eventually meets the enemy who defines them, the one rival who refuses to fit into the plan. For Rome, it was Hannibal. For Charlemagne, it was a Westphalian nobleman named Widukind. Widukind is one of the most enigmatic figures in European history. We do not know when he was born, and we do not know exactly where he died. He left behind no coins stamped with his face and no chronicles written by his own scribes. To the Frankish historians who recorded these events, he was barely human. They described him as a rebel, a traitor, and a worker of wickedness. But to the Saxons, he was the breath of resistance. He was not a king in the traditional sense. The Saxons had no single monarch, only a loose confederation of chieftains. But Widukind possessed a gravity that pulled the scattered tribes together. He was the embodiment of the refusal to submit. The war that unfolded between these two men was a clash of incompatible styles. Charlemagne fought like a Roman emperor reborn. He moved in vast, disciplined columns of heavy cavalry. He built wooden fortresses, baptized the vanquished by force, and established garrisons to hold the land. He fought with the weight of civilization behind him. Widukind fought like the forest itself. He understood that he could never defeat the Frankish war machine in an open field. So he refused to give them one. He adopted what we would now call guerrilla tactics. When the Frankish armies marched north in the summer, Widukind would vanish. He would slip across the border into Denmark, finding sanctuary with the pagan king Sigfrid. He became a ghost, waiting for the heavy footsteps of Charlemagne's army to fade. But the moment Charlemagne turned south, distracted by troubles in Italy or Spain, Widukind would return. He would emerge from the mists of the north, rallying the tribes with speeches of freedom and the old gods. The Frankish garrisons, isolated in their wooden forts, would find the forest suddenly alive with enemies. Churches were burned, priests were driven out, and the newly baptized Saxons were forced to wash off their Christianity in the rivers of Westphalia. For Charlemagne, this was maddening. He was a man of action who believed in decisive victories. He could conquer a city, he could crush an army, but he could not fight smoke. Year after year, the pattern repeated. The Franks would conquer, the Saxons would submit. Charlemagne would leave, and Widukind would return to light the fires of rebellion once more. The psychological toll of this endless war began to weigh heavily on the king. The Saxons were not just an enemy, they were a recurring failure. The constant need to march north again and again drained the treasury and exhausted the nobility. The Saxon terror became a phrase whispered with dread in the Frankish court. By the late 770s, the conflict had ceased to be a war of territory. It had become personal. Widukind was no longer just a rebel leader. He was a mockery of Charlemagne's power. As long as the Wolf of Saxony remained free, Charlemagne's empire was incomplete. The frustration in the Frankish camp grew palpable. The chivalric ideals of mercy and diplomatic exchange began to erode, replaced by a darker, harder resolve. Charlemagne realized that standard warfare had failed. If he wanted to break the cycle, he would have to do something drastic. He would have to stop fighting the soldiers and start punishing the soul of the people. The stage was set for a tragedy. The cat-and-mouse game in the forests was about to end, and in its place, a horrific act of violence would occur, one that would leave a permanent scar on the reputation of the Father of Europe. In 778, the gaze of the king turned south once more, but this time it was drawn by a seduction. A delegation arrived from the far side of the Pyrenees, led by the governor of Barcelona, Suleiman al-Arabi. He spun a tale of a fractured Islamic Spain, a land of bickering princes ripe for liberation. He promised that if Charlemagne marched south, the cities would open their gates. and the upper march of Al-Andalus would fall into Frankish hands like ripe fruit. It was a tempting prospect. Charlemagne, usually so calculating, allowed himself to be charmed by the vision of a quick, glorious conquest. He saw himself as the protector of Christians in the south, extending his reach to the banks of the Ebro River. He gathered a massive army, calling troops from across his dominions, Lombards, Bavarians, Franks, and Burgundians. It was a force designed to overwhelm. But Spain was not a ripe fruit, it was a stone. When the Frankish army arrived at the gates of Zaragoza, they found them firmly shut. The promised allies had changed their minds, or perhaps they had never intended to submit in the first place. The local Muslim rulers looked at the size of Charlemagne's army and decided they preferred their independence. The campaign was a failure. There were no great battles, only the sweltering heat, the dust of the plains, and the humiliating realization that the king had been played. With supplies running low and rumors of a fresh Saxon revolt brewing in the north, Charlemagne made the heavy decision to turn back. He ordered a retreat. The army began the long, slow climb back through the Pyrenees Mountains. The mood was somber. To ensure discipline, the column stretched out for miles along the narrow Roman road that wound through the peaks. Charlemagne rode at the front with the main body of the army, his eyes already fixed on the troubles awaiting him in Saxony. Trailing miles behind him was the baggage train, the wagons, the loot, and the supplies. Guarding this vulnerable tail was the rear guard, a select group of the king's most trusted officers. Among them was a man named Hruodland, the prefect of the March of Brittany. To history, he is known as Roland, the hero of the Song of Roland, a figure of myth who blew his oliphant horn until his temples burst. But to Charlemagne, Hruodland was not a legend. He was a man of flesh and blood, a companion of the table, and one of the few people the king could trust implicitly with his life. As the rear guard entered the narrow pass of Roncevaux, the trap was sprung. It was not the Saracens who attacked them, as the later poems would claim. It was the Basques. They were the people of the mountains, fiercely independent and lightly armed. They knew every ravine and cliff edge. They did not fight in formation. They dropped from the heights like stones. The attack was sudden and total. The Basques rolled boulders down the slopes, crushing the horses and shattering the wagon wheels. Before the Franks could form a shield wall, the enemy was upon them. The skirmish was brief, brutal, and chaotic. In the narrow confines of the pass, the heavy armor of the Franks became a liability. They were swarmed. The rearguard fought with the desperation of men who knew they were cut off, but there was no escape. Every single man in the rearguard was killed. Hruodland, Egehard the Seneschal, and Anselm the Count of the Palace, men who had served the king for years, were slaughtered in the shadows of the ravine. By the time the news reached the front of the column, it was too late. Charlemagne turned his army around, riding back in a fury to save his men, but he found only silence. The Basques had vanished into the mist, taking the baggage and leaving the dead. The defeat at Roncevaux was the only major military defeat of Charlemagne's life. But the pain was not strategic, it was personal. This was not just the loss of soldiers, it was the amputation of his inner circle. In a world of shifting alliances and treacherous family members, men like Hruodland were the anchors of Charlemagne's sanity. Losing them left a void that no conquest could fill. The king did not speak of Roncevaux often. The official chronicles gloss over the disaster, embarrassed by the failure. But the silence speaks volumes. It was a wound that refused to close. For the rest of his life, Charlemagne would carry the memory of that day, the day he rode ahead and left his friends behind in the dark. It was a harsh lesson in vulnerability. The king of the Franks was powerful, but he was not untouchable. And as he rode north, leaving the mountains behind, the grief hardened into something colder. The man who emerged from the Pyrenees was less trusting, more severe, and prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure that he would never be humiliated again. That resolve would soon be tested, for the Saxons were waiting, and this time there would be no mercy. If Roncesvalles was a tragedy of circumstance, the events of 782 were a tragedy of choice. This year stands as the darkest chapter in the biography of Charlemagne, a moment where the veil of the wise Christian king slips, revealing the ruthless warlord underneath. Charlemagne had returned from Spain exhausted. He had hoped for a respite, a season of peace to govern his realm and watch his children grow. But the north would not sleep. While the king was navigating the Pyrenees, Widukind had returned from his exile in Denmark. Like a spark in dry tinder, the wolf had set Saxony ablaze once again. The news that reached Charlemagne was catastrophic. A Frankish army, led by some of his most senior officials, including his chamberlain Adalgis and his constable Gilo, had been ambushed in the Suntel Mountains. It was a total annihilation. The Saxons had not just defeated the Franks, they had wiped them out. 2 of the king's closest lieutenants were dead, their bodies left in the mud of a foreign hill. For Charlemagne, this was the breaking point. He had spent 10 years offering treaties, exchanging hostages, and building churches. He had tried diplomacy, and he had tried limited warfare. In return, he had received only betrayal and the death of his friends. The patience that had defined his early reign evaporated. He did not call for a campaign, he called for judgment. He marched his army to the confluence of the Aller and Weser rivers, to a place called Verden. It was not a battle. The Saxons, perhaps terrified by the sheer speed of his arrival, did not fight. They surrendered. Widukind, true to his nature, had already fled back to the safety of the north, leaving his people to face the storm alone. Charlemagne demanded the rebels. He ordered the Saxon elders to deliver every man who had participated in the uprising. Desperate to save their own villages, the elders complied. They rounded up their own kin, warriors, farmers, sons and fathers, and marched them to the Frankish camp. The chronicles state that 4,500 men were gathered on the banks of the river. We can imagine the scene, the silence of the autumn afternoon, disturbed only by the shuffling of feet and the clanking of Frankish armor. The prisoners likely expected slavery, or perhaps a forced baptism, the standard punishments of the time. But Charlemagne gave a different order. In a single day, 4,500 men were beheaded. The scale of the killing is difficult to comprehend. It was a methodical, industrial slaughter that turned the waters of the Aller River red. It was not a battle frenzy. It was a cold, administrative decision. Charlemagne watched the execution of 4,500 men with the stony resolve of a man who believed he was doing God's work. Why did he do it? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some argue it was a snap of rage, a grief-stricken reaction to the death of his friends at Suntel. Others see it as a calculated act of terror, a shock and awe strategy designed to break the Saxon spirit permanently. But the most chilling interpretation is that Charlemagne simply stopped seeing the Saxons as enemies to be conquered, and started seeing them as criminals to be punished. In his eyes, they had broken their oaths to him and to God. They were no longer soldiers, they were apostates. The massacre of Verdun left a permanent stain on Charlemagne's legacy. It was an act that even his own courtiers struggled to justify. In the years that followed, the wise narrator of his life, Einhard, would gloss over the event, uncomfortable with the brutality of his master. Yet, if Charlemagne expected this violence to bring peace, he was mistaken. The massacre did not break the Saxons. It united them in a fury of survival. The war would drag on for another 20 years. But for Charlemagne, Verdun marked a psychological shift. The young, optimistic conqueror was gone. In his place stood the emperor, a man who had learned that building a heaven on earth sometimes required walking through hell. And as the king washed the blood from his hands, he turned his attention away from the battlefield, seeking solace in the one place where he could find order and light, the sanctuary of his own library. After the blood of Verdun and the cold winds of the Saxon forests, the story moves to a warmer, quieter place. We travel to Aachen, not the fortress, but the library. It is easy to imagine Charlemagne only as a warrior in iron forever on a horse. But the man himself would have told you that his sword was merely a tool to protect what he truly loved, wisdom. In the intervals between his endless wars, Charlemagne did not rest. He studied. He transformed his court into an intellectual oasis, sparking what history now calls the Carolingian Renaissance. He realized that a kingdom built only on conquest is fragile. To build something that lasts, one must build the mind. And so he began to collect people. He sent letters to the corners of the known world, inviting the brightest minds to come to Aachen. From Italy came Peter of Pisa, from Spain came Theodulf, and from England came the greatest prize of them all, a monk named Alcuin of York. Alcuin was not a courtier, he was a teacher, and in Charlemagne he found the most eager student in Europe. The palace school was not a rigid university with silent lecture halls. It was a vibrant, chaotic circle of friends who ate, drank, and debated together. They created a world of their own, insulated from the brutality of the era. In this circle, rank was left at the door. To foster intimacy and equality, they took on nicknames. Alcuin was Flaccus, the poet. Angilbert was Homer. And Charlemagne, the fearsome king of the Franks, called himself David, the humble king who sang psalms to God. It is in this school that we see the most human side of the emperor. Charlemagne was a man of immense physical power, fluent in speech and terrifying in battle. But there was one conquest that always eluded him. He could not write. His biographer, Einhard, gives us a touching detail that dissolves the centuries between us and the king. He tells us that Charlemagne would keep wax tablets and sheets of parchment tucked under his pillows at night. In the quiet hours, when the palace was asleep and the crown was set aside, the most powerful man in the West would sit up in bed, his callous, scarred hands struggling to form the delicate curves of the alphabet. He practiced fervently, tracing the letters over and over again in the candlelight. But as Einhard gently notes, the effort came too late. His hand, trained to grip the hilt of a sword, could never quite master the quill. There is a profound humility in this image. The king who could order the execution of thousands could not command his own hand to write his name with grace. It reveals a man who was deeply aware of his own limitations, a man who revered the written word precisely because he understood its difficulty. But while he struggled with the pen, he excelled with the mind. He loved riddles. The court at Aachen was famous for its intellectual games, where the king and his scholars would challenge each other with complex theological questions and word puzzles. It was a place of laughter and curiosity, a Athens in the mist of the north. This intellectual circle was not just a hobby, it was the engine of the empire. These men, Alcuin, Einhard and the others, were the architects of Charlemagne's legacy. They preserved the ancient texts, standardized the handwriting we still use today, and educated the clergy. Yet, within this bright circle of scholars and friends, there was another circle, tighter, more possessive, and far more complicated. If Alcuin was the ruler of Charlemagne's mind, there was a group of young women who held the keys to his heart, and his love for them was a suffocating force that would breed its own kind of tragedy. It is a curious paradox of history that men who can rule empires often struggle to rule their own homes. Charlemagne, the emperor who imposed strict religious laws on a continent, presided over a household that by the standards of the church was scandalously irregular. At the center of this domestic storm were his daughters. Charlemagne was a man of immense, suffocating affection. While his sons were sent off to govern provinces and lead armies, his daughters, Rotrud, Bertha, and Gisela, were kept close. They were the crowned doves of the palace, a constellation of young women who were educated, beautiful, and fiercely protected. They rode with the king on hunts, they sat with him at feasts, and they travelled with the army. Where the king went, the daughters followed. But as they grew from children into women, the courts of Europe began to ask the inevitable question: who would they marry? Suitors came from far and wide. The Byzantine emperor even requested the hand of Rotrud for his son, a match that would have united the East and West. But Charlemagne, the master diplomat, stalled. He delayed, and eventually he refused them all. He made a decision that baffled his contemporaries. He forbade his daughters from marrying. His biographer Einhard, trying to explain this possessiveness, offers a simple human reason. He loved them so much that he could never bear to be parted from them. It is a sentence that paints a picture of a lonely giant, a man who found the burdens of kingship bearable only when surrounded by the unconditional love of his family. But there was likely a colder political calculus at work as well. Charlemagne knew that a son-in-law is a dangerous thing. A husband to a royal daughter creates a rival claimant, a new branch of the family tree that might one day challenge his own sons. By keeping his daughters unmarried, he kept his power undivided. However, nature does not obey royal decrees. While the daughters were officially unmarried, they were not nuns. The court at Aachen was a place of high culture and low whispers. In the shadows of the palace, illicit romances bloomed. The most famous of these was between the Princess Bertha and the poet Angilbert, one of Charlemagne's closest friends and advisors. They did not just share whispered words, they shared a life. Bertha gave birth to 2 sons by Angilbert. Her sister Rotrud also took a lover, the Count of Maine, and bore a son. This creates a fascinating image of life at the palace. Here was Charlemagne, the defender of the faith, issuing laws against adultery and demanding moral purity from his subjects. Yet, under his own roof, his unmarried daughters were raising illegitimate children. How did the king react? He chose blindness. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne pretended that these things did not exist. He welcomed the illegitimate grandchildren with open arms, loving them as fiercely as he loved his daughters. He refused to acknowledge the scandal, preferring to live in a comfortable denial rather than lose the company of the women he adored. It was a delicate, silent truce. The daughters stayed loyal, and the father stayed quiet. But this possessive love came with a cost. By refusing to let them leave the nest, Charlemagne trapped them in a golden cage. They lived in a state of perpetual adolescence, powerful within the palace walls, but vulnerable the moment they stepped outside them. They were safe only as long as he was alive. As the years passed, the laughter of the daughters and the games of the grandchildren must have provided a sweet distraction for the aging king. But outside the warm glow of the family hearth, the sky was darkening. Far to the south, in the eternal city of Rome, a crisis was brewing that would demand more than just Charlemagne's love. It would demand his sword, and it would lead to the single most famous moment of the Middle Ages. To understand the climax of Charlemagne's life, we must first look at a crime scene in Rome. By the end of the 8th century, Rome was no longer the marble capital of the Caesars. It was a city of ruins and rivalries, a dangerous labyrinth where ancient families fought for control of the papacy, like street gangs fighting for turf. In 799, the man sitting on the chair of St. Peter was Leo III. He was a man of humble origins, and the Roman aristocracy hated him for it. On April 25th, the Pope was leading a procession through the city. It was the day of the Major Litanies, a solemn religious event. As he rode near the church of San Silvestro, the trap was sprung. Armed men burst from the crowd. They pulled the Pope from his horse and dragged him into the dirt. These were not random bandits. They were led by Paschalis and Campulus, high-ranking officials and relatives of the previous pope. They had a specific gruesome goal. They did not want to kill Leo. They wanted to disqualify him. In the brutal canon law of the time, a man who was physically mutilated could not serve as a priest. The attackers pinned the Pope to the ground and attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut off his tongue. The assault was savage. Leo was left bloody and unconscious in the street, then dragged into a monastery and locked away. The conspirators believed they had ended his reign. But whether by a miracle, as the Church would later claim, or by the sheer incompetence of the assassins, Leo survived. His sight returned and his speech recovered. With the help of loyal servants, he escaped the city by night, fleeing first to Spoleto and then embarking on a desperate journey north. He was heading for the only man in the world powerful enough to save him. The meeting took place in Paderborn, in the heart of Saxony. It is one of the most striking tableaus of the Middle Ages. Charlemagne, the warrior king, sat surrounded by his army, fresh from another campaign. Riding into the camp came the Vicar of Christ, battered, scarred, and begging for protection. For Charlemagne, this was a moment of supreme opportunity. The spiritual leader of the Western world was now a refugee in his tent. But the situation was complicated. Leo's enemies had sent messengers of their own, bearing heavy accusations. They claimed the Pope was guilty of perjury and adultery, charges that, if true, would strip him of his holy office. Charlemagne found himself in an impossible position. He was being asked to judge the Pope. But who on earth had the authority to judge the judge of all men? The court at Paderborn became a hive of secret negotiations. We do not know exactly what was said in those private meetings between the king and the pontiff, but Historians suspect a deal was struck in the shadows. Leo needed his enemies crushed and his name cleared. Charlemagne needed something else, something that would elevate him above the title of king and secure his legacy forever. The agreement was made. Charlemagne would march to Rome. He wouldn't go as a conqueror, but as a protector. He would reinstate the Pope and preside over a trial to settle the accusations. In the winter of 800, the massive Frankish host crossed the Alps once more. Charlemagne entered Rome in December, the undisputed master of Italy. He convened a council to hear the charges against Leo, but the outcome was predetermined. On December the 23rd, in a ceremony of carefully choreographed theatre, Leo swore an oath on the Gospels that he was innocent. Since no earthly man could judge him, his oath was accepted as final. The Pope was saved. The conspirators were condemned, order was restored. But as the calendar turned to December 25th, the true price of the Pope's rescue was about to be paid. The stage was set for a Christmas Mass that would change the map of the world. The morning of December 25th, 800, broke cold and clear over the city of Rome. The air inside old St. Peter's Basilica was thick with incense and the murmurs of the Frankish nobility, the Roman clergy, and the curious citizens who had gathered for the Christmas Mass. It was a scene of heavy velvet and flickering candlelight, the kind of solemn atmosphere where history feels suspended, waiting for a signal. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks and the Lombards, approached the altar. He was dressed not in his usual Frankish tunic and trousers, but in the long tunic and chlamys of a Roman patrician, a rare concession to local custom, perhaps worn at the Pope's specific request. He knelt in prayer at the shrine of the Apostle, his head bowed, a picture of pious humility. As he began to rise, Pope Leo III stepped forward. In his hands he held a crown. It was not the simple gold circlet of a Germanic warlord, but an imperial diadem. Before Charlemagne could stand fully upright, Leo placed the crown upon his head. The moment the gold touched his brow, the silence of the basilica was shattered. The congregation, clearly rehearsed, erupted into a thunderous chant that echoed off the stone walls. To Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor, life and victory. 3 times they shouted it. With those words, the world shifted. For over 300 years, the title of emperor had belonged solely to the ruler in Constantinople, the guardian of the Roman legacy in the East. The West had been a fractured landscape of barbarian kingdoms. But in this single electrified moment, the Pope had declared that the Roman Empire was reborn, and its heart was no longer on the Bosphorus, but on the Rhine. But as the cheers faded and the weight of the crown settled, a strange shadow fell over the event. According to Charlemagne's biographer and friend Einhard, the new emperor was not pleased. In fact, he was furious. Einhard later wrote that Charlemagne declared he would not have set foot in the church that day, even though it was a great feast day, if he had foreseen the design of the Pope. This statement has baffled historians for centuries. Was Charlemagne truly surprised? It seems unlikely. A coronation is a complex political ritual. It requires a crown, a script, and a shouting crowd. It is hard to believe that the most controlling man in Europe, surrounded by his own guards and advisors, could be ambushed with an imperial title he didn't want. The more likely truth is that Charlemagne was engaging in a brilliant piece of political theatre. By claiming he was surprised, he could pretend that the title was forced upon him by God and the Pope. This offered him a diplomatic shield. If the emperor in Constantinople complained that Charlemagne was a usurper stealing the Roman title, Charlemagne could simply shrug and say, "I did not ask for this. It was the will of the Church." It also served a domestic purpose. By accepting the crown from the Pope, he was signaling to his own nobles that his authority was no longer just tribal, it was divine. He was no longer just a king chosen by Franks, he was an emperor chosen by heaven. Yet there was a danger in this ritual, one that Charlemagne surely recognized. By allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head, he had created a precedent. If the Pope had the power to give the empire, did he also have the power to take it away? It was a question that would haunt the relationship between popes and emperors for the next 1,000 years. But on that winter day in Rome, the future conflicts were far away. The reality was simple and overwhelming. The king of the Franks, the grandson of a mayor of the palace, had risen to the height of human power. He was now the new Caesar. As he walked out of the basilica and into the winter sunlight, Charlemagne carried a new burden. He was no longer just defending a kingdom, he was upholding an idea. He was the guardian of Christendom. And as he looked toward the east, he knew that his new title would not be greeted with cheers, but with shock and likely war. The Byzantine bride was watching, and she was not amused. In the courts of Aachen, the coronation was a triumph. But in the marble halls of Constantinople, it was a crime. To the Byzantines, there was only one Roman Empire, and its capital sat on the Bosphorus. They viewed themselves not as Greeks or Easterners, but as the Romaioi, the Romans. In their eyes, Charlemagne was nothing more than a glorified barbarian chieftain wearing a stolen hat. The news that a Frankish king had dared to call himself emperor was greeted with shock and derision. This created a dangerous diplomatic crisis. The world, it seemed, was not big enough for two Caesars. However, the throne in Constantinople was currently occupied by a figure as formidable and ruthless as Charlemagne himself. Her name was Irene. Irene is one of history's most terrifyingly competent survivors. She had begun as a mere regent for her son, Constantine VI. But when the boy came of age and attempted to push his mother aside, Irene did not step down. She fought back. In a move that appalled even the hardened Byzantine court, she ordered her own son to be blinded, the traditional disqualification for rule in the East, and took the throne for herself. She now ruled alone as Basileus, emperor, not Basilissa, cast empress. She was the Iron Lady of the East. Charlemagne, looking across the map, saw an opportunity that was as audacious as it was romantic. He did not want to fight a war with Byzantium. He wanted to buy it. Or rather, he wanted to marry it. In 802, ambassadors travelled from Aachen to Constantinople with a proposal that would have rewritten the history of the world. Charlemagne proposed marriage to Irene. It sounds like fiction, but the logic was sound. A union between Charlemagne and Irene would have reunited the two halves of the Roman Empire for the first time since antiquity. It would have healed the Great Schism before it fully began. It was a vision of a single Christian superpower stretching from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Remarkably, Irene listened. She was isolated in her own court, surrounded by powerful men who resented being ruled by a woman. A marriage to the powerful Western emperor might have secured her position. The ambassadors began the delicate dance of negotiation. The wedding of the millennium seemed, for a brief, breathless moment, to be actually possible. But the mere whisper of a Frankish marriage terrified the Byzantine bureaucracy. The officials in Constantinople feared that their refined ancient city would be overrun by uncouth Franks. They feared that their empire would become a mere province of Aachen. The reaction was swift and brutal. While Charlemagne's ambassadors were still in the city, a palace coup erupted. A high-ranking finance minister named Nicephorus conspired with the palace guards. They surrounded the empress, deposed her, and seized the throne. There would be no wedding. Irene, the woman who had blinded her son to keep her crown, was stripped of everything. She was exiled to the island of Lesbos, forced to live out her remaining days in poverty, spinning wool to earn her bread. She died less than a year later. The ambassadors returned to Charlemagne with empty hands and heavy news. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. The East and West would not be united. Instead, they would drift further apart, separated by a widening gulf of culture, religion, and politics. Charlemagne took the rejection with his usual pragmatic stoicism. He did not launch a war of vengeance. He simply turned his eyes back to his own borders. He was an old man now, entering his 60s. The fire of conquest was dimming, replaced by the cold, creeping realization that while he had built an empire, he might not be able to save it from what was coming next. For on the northern horizon, the first dragon ships were beginning to appear. By the year 810, Charlemagne was a man walking through the winter of his life. He was nearly 70 years old, an ancient age for a man who had spent 40 years in the saddle. The towering energy that had driven him across the Alps and through the Saxon forests began to dim. His body, once iron, was now besieged by fevers and a limp that would not heal. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the silence that was filling his halls. History often forgets that kings are also fathers. Charlemagne had spent decades carefully grooming his 3 legitimate sons, Charles, Pepin, and Louis, to inherit his empire. He had designed a succession plan to ensure that the realm would be divided peacefully, securing the future of the dynasty. Then fate intervened with cruel efficiency. In 810, his son Pepin, the king of Italy, died suddenly. The court was plunged into mourning. But before the emperor could fully grieve, the blow fell again. In 811, his eldest son, Charles the Younger, the rock upon whom he had built his hopes, also died. In the span of 2 years, the future of the Carolingian world collapsed. Of his 3 heirs, only the youngest, Louis, remained. Louis was a pious, gentle man, better suited for a monastery than a throne. Charlemagne looked at his only surviving son, and surely felt a cold shiver of anxiety. He saw the fragility of everything he had built. It is in this season of grief that the chroniclers record a moment of haunting foresight. The emperor was staying in a coastal town in southern Gaul. As he sat at dinner, looking out over the Mediterranean, strange ships appeared on the horizon. They were not the clumsy merchant vessels of the time. They were sleek, low in the water, and moved with a terrifying speed. The guests at the table argued about what they were, perhaps Jewish merchants or African traders. But Charlemagne, with the sharp eyes of an old predator, knew better. He recognized the shape of the hulls. They were Northmen, Vikings. The ships did not land. Seeing the harbour was fortified, they turned and slipped back into the open sea. But the incident left the emperor shaken. The monk of St. Gall, writing later, tells us that Charlemagne rose from the table and stood at the window for a long time, tears streaming down his face. When his nobles dared to ask why he was weeping, he replied, I am not afraid that these men will harm me, but I am tormented by a great grief that they dared to approach this coast while I was still alive, and I foresee with horror the evil they will do to my descendants and their subjects." It was a prophetic sadness. Charlemagne realized that the nature of war was changing. He had spent his life fighting enemies who stood on solid ground: Saxons, Lombards, Avars. He could march to their capitals and burn their forts. But how could he fight the sea? These new enemies had no capital to conquer. They were like the wind. They struck and vanished. He tried to prepare. He ordered fleets to be built and watchtowers to be constructed along the rivers. But the old emperor knew deep in his bones that the walls were beginning to crack. In 813, sensing that his own end was near, Charlemagne summoned Louis to Aachen. In a solemn ceremony, he did not wait for the Pope. He ordered Louis to take the crown from the altar and place it on his own head. It was the final act of a man who wanted to ensure that power was transferred without question. He had done all he could. He had conquered Europe, revived the empire, and defended the faith. Now there was nothing left to do but let go. The hunt was over. The story ends where it began, in the heart of winter. In January of 814, Charlemagne was in Aachen. Despite his age and his failing health, the old restlessness had not left him. He spent his days in the forests of the Ardennes, hunting with the vigor of a man half his age. To Charlemagne, the hunt was not just a sport, it was a defiance of mortality. As long as he could ride, as long as he could cast a spear, he was still the king. But the body, unlike an empire, cannot be conquered by will alone. After bathing in the warm sulphur springs of the palace, the very springs that had drawn him to build his capital there, he was seized by a sudden, violent fever. The physicians called it pleurisy. The emperor, stubborn to the last, refused their advice. He believed, as he always had, that the body could purge its own sickness. He dismissed the roasted meats they offered and chose to fast, drinking only water. For 7 days, the man who had reshaped Europe lay in his chamber, fighting a battle he could not win with a sword. The palace fell silent. The scholars, the generals, and the daughters he had held so close gathered in the shadowed hallways, waiting for the inevitable. The breath that had commanded armies and whispered prayers grew shallow. On the morning of January 28th at 9 o'clock, the struggle ended. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, the king of the Lombards, and the emperor of the Romans, closed his eyes. The burial was not delayed. On that very day, his body was carried into the Palatine Chapel, the magnificent octagonal church he had built to the glory of God. It was a building designed to mimic the holy structures of Jerusalem and Ravenna, a stone testament to his ambition to blend the earthly and the divine. He was not buried in a dark, obscure crypt. He was laid to rest in the very center of his world. There is a persistent legend, whispered by later chroniclers, that he was not laid flat in a coffin, but placed sitting upright on a marble throne, clutching a scepter, with a golden copy of the Gospels resting on his knees, an emperor eternally holding court in the silence of the tomb. While history suggests a simpler interment beneath the floor, the image endures because it feels true. It is hard to imagine Charlemagne lying down, even in death. He left behind a world transformed. The borders he drew would become the outlines of modern France and Germany. The schools he founded would preserve the light of learning through the Dark Ages, and the title he revived would echo through history for 1,000 years. But on that cold afternoon in Aachen, as the heavy stone slab was slid into place, the politics and the legacy did not matter. The noise of the battles, the scratch of the quills, and the whispers of the court finally ceased. The father of Europe had found his rest.